AITA for refusing to pay the bill for my girlfriend's parents at my restaurant. Her parents are just customers and have to pay. I own a small but successful restaurant in my town. It has been my dream for years, and I worked hard, really hard, to get to where I am now. Blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights went into making it what it is today. I take pride in my work, in my team, in the food we serve, and in the experience we create for our customers. I am proud to be a business owner, and I take my responsibilities seriously. My girlfriend, Sarah, has been nothing but supportive. She often comes by to eat, and of course, I treat her. She is my girlfriend, after all. It is not just about the money, it is about making her feel special, showing her that she matters to me. I have no problem with that. It is not like she takes advantage of it, she does not show up with a group of friends expecting free meals. She just enjoys having a place where she can sit comfortably, eat good food, and feel connected to my world. A few weeks ago, Sarah and I talked about taking the next step in our relationship, meeting her parents. I knew it was an important milestone, and I wanted to make a good impression. She suggested we have dinner at my restaurant since they had always been curious about where I worked. It made sense, this was my domain, the place I had built from the ground up. I could make sure everything was perfect, control the experience, and ensure that they had the best meal possible. I agreed without hesitation. The evening arrived, and I made sure everything was flawless. I reserved the best table, the one with the best view and the most comfortable seating. I instructed the kitchen to be at the top of their game, reminded the waitstaff that we had important guests, and even ensured that the lighting and music were just right. I wanted everything to be perfect. Sarah walked in first, looking elegant but casual, the way she always did when she wanted to impress without seeming like she was trying too hard. Her parents followed, a middle-aged couple, Jeff and Linda, who carried themselves with an air of polite curiosity. Jeff had a firm handshake, the kind that tried to gauge a man's strength in the first 5 seconds. Linda had a warm but slightly scrutinizing smile, the kind that mothers give when they are trying to decide if you are good enough for their daughter. I welcomed them warmly, introduced myself properly, and led them to the table I had set aside for them. As they settled in, they looked around, taking in the atmosphere. The restaurant had a modern but cozy feel, the kind of place where people could enjoy an intimate dinner but also celebrate something special. They complimented the decor, the lighting, the general ambience. Jeff even chuckled and said, "Now we understand why our daughter enjoys her dates so much. If you cook as well as your chefs, she must be very well fed." That set the tone for a relaxed, pleasant dinner. They asked me a lot of questions, how I started the restaurant, what challenges I faced, how business was going. I answered with enthusiasm, talking about the struggles of opening a restaurant, the long nights, the times when I thought I would not make it, and the pride I felt in finally getting to this point. They listened intently, nodding, smiling, occasionally sharing their own anecdotes about hard work and perseverance. The food arrived, and they were impressed. They ordered a variety of dishes, starters, main courses, even a few glasses of wine. They praised everything, from the presentation to the flavors, and Linda even said that this was one of the best meals she had ever had. It was going better than I had expected. By the time dessert arrived, I felt like I had won them over. They were warm, engaged, genuinely enjoying themselves. I felt relieved, thinking that this was a perfect introduction, a great way to show them who I was and what I had built. And then the bill arrived. Jeff reached for his wallet, a casual motion, but then he paused. He looked at me, slightly confused, and said, "Oh, we thought this was your treat. Sarah said she doesn't have to pay here." I blinked. The energy in the room shifted ever so slightly, a subtle crack in the otherwise smooth evening. I kept my expression neutral and responded as calmly as I could. "Sarah is my girlfriend, so I treat her. But for everyone else, the restaurant operates on standard rules." There was a brief silence. Linda's eyebrows lifted slightly, and Jeff's fingers tapped on his wallet for a moment before he spoke again. "We thought since you invited us, it would be more of a family dinner kind of thing." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. "But this is my business," I explained. "And you are customers. If I start treating everyone I invite, it sets a bad precedent. My staff is watching. If I comp this meal, they will start wondering why their friends or family can't get the same treatment." It's also about respecting the restaurant. You had great food, excellent service. Jeff's jaw tightened ever so slightly. His expression did not change much, but there was a shift in his demeanor. He exhaled through his nose, nodded once, and muttered something under his breath, something about interesting hospitality. He placed his card down on the table and gave a brief nod to the waiter, who quickly took it and processed the payment. Linda said nothing, but the warmth she had shown earlier was noticeably absent. Sarah remained silent. She had been watching the exchange with slightly widened eyes, and while she did not say anything, I could feel the tension in the way she glanced between me and her parents. Once the transaction was done, they stood up, thanked me for the dinner, though the words felt a little forced, and made their way toward the door. I walked with them, offering a polite smile, though I could feel the distance that had suddenly formed between us. At the entrance, Sarah lingered for a moment, looking at me with a slightly strained expression. She did not say anything outright, but I could tell she was not entirely pleased with how things had played out. She gave me a small, tight-lipped smile, then turned and followed her parents out the door. I stood there for a moment, exhaling slowly. The evening had started so well, but now I was left with an odd feeling in my chest, a mix of frustration, confusion, and a lingering sense of unease. Had I done something wrong? Was I really supposed to just comp the whole meal to avoid an awkward moment? Or was I right to draw the line? I could not shake the feeling that, no matter how justified I felt, this was going to be a conversation with Sarah later. Update 1. The next day, I was busy with the usual morning routine at the restaurant, checking inventory, talking to the kitchen staff about the specials, making sure everything was prepped for the lunch rush. It was a normal day, or at least it should have been. But there was a weight in my chest, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite settled. I didn't have to wait long to find out why. My phone buzzed, and I saw Sarah's name on the screen. I barely had time to say hello before she was already talking, her voice sharp, cutting through any pretense of politeness. What an idiot. Why did you make my parents pay? There was no greeting, no build-up, just straight to the point, straight to anger. I exhaled slowly, pressing the phone to my ear as I stepped out of the main dining area. I had expected this conversation, but not this level of hostility. I started to explain, trying to keep my voice steady, that this was my restaurant, my business. That it wasn't about personal invitations or family dinners, it was about setting a precedent, about running things fairly. If I comped meals for every person I invited, where would it stop? She wasn't listening. She cut me off before I could finish, her voice rising. Now they think you are just greedy. I told you that they considered it an invitation. It is like inviting someone to your house and asking them to pay for dinner. I clenched my jaw, inhaled through my nose, and forced myself to stay calm. A restaurant is not a house. A restaurant is a business. The food, the service, the atmosphere, all of it costs money. I wasn't running a charity, and I hadn't even thought of it in the context of a home invitation. But before I could get the words out, she let out a frustrated sigh and cut me off again. I think you do not understand how humiliating it was for them, she said, her tone dripping with disappointment. And then she hung up. I stood there for a few moments, staring at my phone, the call already ended. The restaurant hummed around me, the distant clatter of dishes, the low murmur of staff preparing for the day. But all I could hear was the last thing she had said. Humiliating. I didn't think I had done anything humiliating. I hadn't meant to embarrass anyone. It was a simple transaction, a meal, a bill, payment. That was how restaurants worked. But to Sarah, to her parents, it had been something else entirely. And now, they saw me as something else entirely. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that afternoon, as I was going over some reports with my manager, he cleared his throat awkwardly and slid his phone across the desk toward me. You might want to take a look at this, he said, and the moment I glanced at the screen, I felt my stomach drop. It was a new online review. A 1-star review. I never thought the owner of this restaurant would invite people and make them pay. If you're curious, check it out for yourself. Business isn't built on greed. Linda had written it. I sat back in my chair, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as I read it again, and again, trying to process what I was looking at. There it was, in black and white, a public condemnation of my character, my business ethics, my hospitality. And it wasn't just a private complaint. It was out there for anyone to see. Customers, potential diners, regulars who had been supporting my restaurant for years. A 1-star review didn't just hurt my pride. It hurt my business. I could already picture people scrolling through my restaurant's page, seeing the glowing 5-star reviews about the food, the service, the ambience, and then stopping at this. One harsh, bitter comment standing out among the praise. I could feel the slow burn of anger creeping up my spine. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was an attack. I had been polite. I had provided excellent service. I had given them the best table, made sure they had a flawless experience. And this was what I got in return. A passive-aggressive, spiteful review meant to paint me as some kind of greedy, heartless businessman. I exhaled through my nose, forcing myself to stay calm. This was personal. Linda hadn't just been disappointed, she had been offended. Deeply enough that she felt the need to go out of her way to make sure everyone else knew it. The manager shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Do you want to respond to it?" he asked. I stared at the screen for a long moment. I could respond. I could explain my side of the story, make it clear that I had never explicitly invited them for a free meal, that I had treated them just like I would treat any other guests. I could defend myself. But what would that accomplish? People didn't care about explanations when it came to reviews. They saw a 1-star rating, they read a complaint about greed, and they made their judgments instantly. And responding would only keep the conversation going, draw more attention to it, give it more weight than it deserved. No, I wouldn't respond. Not now, at least. But I also knew this wasn't over. Sarah was angry. Her parents were angry. And now, they weren't just upset with me personally, they were publicly calling my integrity into question. Update 2. I couldn't let it go. I had tried to be professional about it, tried to brush off the review, but it gnawed at me. It wasn't just a bad review, it was an attack, a deliberate attempt to paint me as something I wasn't. And the worst part? It was from someone who sat at my table, ate my food, smiled and laughed through the entire meal, only to turn around and publicly smear me because I had the audacity to run my business the way a business is supposed to be run. I picked up my phone and called Sarah. She answered, her tone immediately guarded, as if she knew why I was calling. I didn't waste time. "Why is your mother ruining my business?" There was a pause, a beat of silence that stretched just a little too long before she responded, her voice completely calm, almost indifferent. They were just sharing their experiences. It's not their fault that other people support their opinion. I felt something snap. Sharing their experiences. They could have told me to my face if they had a problem. Instead, they decided to air it out in public, knowing damn well that a 1-star review can hurt a business like mine. She didn't back down. Her voice sharpened. "You embarrassed them. You put them in a situation where they thought they were your guests, and then you handed them a bill. Do you have any idea how that made them feel?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I never invited them for a free meal. I invited them to experience my restaurant. "There's a difference, Sarah." She scoffed. "You know what? If you treat my family like that, I'm not sure I want to be with you." And just like that, she hung up. I sat there for a moment, gripping my phone, my jaw tight. I had expected an argument. I had expected frustration. But I hadn't expected her to throw out something that sounded a lot like an ultimatum. All because I had asked her parents to pay for their own food. I set my phone down and tried to focus on work, but it was impossible. The whole thing felt ridiculous. I had spent years building my restaurant from the ground up, pouring everything I had into it, and now I was being vilified for doing something as basic as charging for a meal. It wasn't even about the money, it was about principle. About fairness. If I started handing out free meals just to avoid offending people, where would it end? I barely slept that night. My mind kept replaying the conversation, the review, the way Sarah had so effortlessly flipped the situation on me as if I were the one in the wrong. The next day, I walked into the restaurant expecting the usual routine. But as soon as I stepped inside, I noticed something was off. My manager approached me almost immediately, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and concern. We have an insane number of reservations today. That made me pause. Mondays were usually slow. There was no reason for such a spike in reservations. My gut tightened. Something was up. I pulled out my phone and checked our social media. That was when I saw it. Linda had posted about me again. But this time, it wasn't just a review. It was a full-blown viral post on Facebook. If you're curious about this place where the owner invites you to dinner and then makes you pay, come and see for yourself. It had blown up. Hundreds of comments. Shares piling up by the minute. People were tagging their friends, debating in the comments, arguing about whether I was in the right or if I was the embodiment of greed. Some people were furious on my behalf, defending me, calling out the entitlement of expecting a free meal at a business. Others were tearing me apart, claiming I had no manners, that I had no sense of hospitality, that a real man would have never let his girlfriend's parents pay. And then there were those who weren't even taking a side, they were just curious. They wanted to see the infamous, greedy owner, in action. And they were coming. By the time we opened for lunch, the restaurant was packed. Every table was filled, the noise level was higher than usual, and the atmosphere felt different. Some people were here just to eat, but others were openly watching me, whispering, nudging each other when I walked by. A couple at the bar kept sneaking glances at me and giggling under their breath. At one table, a man in his 50s called over a waiter and, loud enough for people nearby to hear, asked, "So if I eat here tonight, will I have to pay? Or do I just need to be invited?" His table burst into laughter. I clenched my jaw but kept my composure. This was what Linda wanted, to turn me into a joke, to make me the villain in some ridiculous, entitled fantasy where I was the bad guy for not giving away free food. But there was another side to it. Not everyone was here to mock me. Some customers were looking at me with curiosity, even respect. I overheard snippets of conversation, people who had read the story and thought it was ridiculous that Linda had reacted the way she did. One woman at a corner table was explaining to her friend why she specifically came to support me. "Honestly, I don't want to eat at a place that just hands out free food to people who whine enough. I'd rather give my money to someone who actually values their business." And the best part? The numbers didn't lie. By the time dinner service rolled around, we had made more money in one day than we typically did in an entire week. The viral post, intended to damage my reputation, had driven traffic through the roof. Some people were here to gawk, some to judge, but plenty were here to eat. Linda had tried to ruin me, but in doing so, she had turned my restaurant into the most talked about place in town. As I stepped into the kitchen to check on my chefs, my manager leaned against the counter, shaking his head with a grin. "So, are you gonna send her flowers as a thank you gift?" I smirked. If this keeps up, I might name a dish after her instead. The storm hadn't passed, not entirely. Sarah was still furious. Linda probably wasn't done. But at that moment, standing in my bustling restaurant, seeing it fuller than ever before, I realized something. I wasn't the one who had lost in this situation. They had tried to break me. But all they had done was make me stronger. Update 3. A week passed, and despite everything, I had to admit something unexpected: business had never been better. The initial surge of customers from Linda's viral Facebook post hadn't been just a one-time thing. The controversy surrounding my restaurant, the whispers of, "Did you hear about that place where the owner made his girlfriend's parents pay?" had become something of a local legend. People weren't just coming to see if I was as greedy as Linda had painted me to be, they were coming out of sheer curiosity, drawn in by the drama, eager to experience the place that had stirred up such an absurd debate. Some came in with an air of mockery, clearly expecting to witness some caricature of a stingy, uptight businessman refusing to let anyone eat for free. Others came in with admiration, wanting to support me for standing my ground against what they saw as entitlement. But regardless of where they stood on the so-called controversy, one thing was undeniable: they were coming. And they were spending money. The restaurant was at full capacity almost every night. Reservations skyrocketed. My staff, initially bewildered by the sudden influx, had settled into a rhythm, adapting to the increased traffic like seasoned pros. The kitchen was running like a well-oiled machine, pumping out some of our best dishes yet. The financial boost was undeniable. Profits had doubled. Some nights, we made in a single evening what we used to make in an entire week. It was the kind of business growth most restaurant owners could only dream of, and the irony wasn't lost on me. If I had just comped that one dinner, if I had tried to appease Sarah's parents in the moment, none of this would have happened. But despite all the success, there was still an unresolved matter lingering in the back of my mind. Sarah. After our heated phone call, she had gone silent. No messages, no calls, nothing. And while I knew I had been justified in my actions, there was still an uneasy feeling in my chest. Then, one afternoon, a notification popped up on my phone. A message from Sarah. "I think we need to talk." I stared at the screen for a moment, weighing what this could mean. Then, without overthinking it, I replied. We set a time to meet that evening, somewhere neutral, a quiet cafe, far away from my restaurant, where we could actually talk. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, stirring a cup of tea absently, her face unreadable. I sat down, bracing myself for another fight, another round of accusations. But when she looked up at me, there was something different in her expression. Less anger. More, something else. Reflection, maybe. She started by admitting something I hadn't expected. Her parents hadn't actually been that upset about paying. They had been surprised, thrown off by the situation, but it wasn't the bill itself that had made them uncomfortable. What really bothered them was that they hadn't known in advance, that the expectation had been set differently in their minds. In their world, an invitation meant hospitality, and hospitality meant the host took care of the meal. They didn't know that, for me, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was a business, a livelihood, something separate from the social rules of family dinners. I listened carefully, taking in every word. And as much as I had stood my ground, I realized she had a point. I had assumed they would see things the way I did. I had assumed they would naturally understand that my business wasn't an extension of my personal generosity. But I had never actually told them that. I had never set the expectation, never clarified the dynamic. And because of that, I had unintentionally put them in a position where they felt awkward, caught off guard. I admitted that, yeah, I probably should have mentioned it beforehand. Given them a heads up, made it clear that while I was treating Sarah, the rest of the dinner would be business as usual. It wasn't about the money, it was about avoiding that uncomfortable moment. Sarah nodded, and then, surprising me, she admitted something of her own. She had overreacted. She had been caught up in the emotions of the moment, embarrassed by how things played out, and instead of talking to me privately, she had let it escalate. She should have handled it differently, and more importantly, her mother should never have taken it to social media. It was the first time since this whole mess started that I felt a real sense of relief. We weren't just throwing blame back and forth anymore. We were actually talking. And just like that, things began to settle. We left the cafe on better terms than we had entered. No lingering hostility, no unresolved resentment. Just an understanding that we had both made mistakes and that, despite the chaos, we still cared about each other. But the most interesting part of all of this? The restaurant's success continued to explode. The Facebook post that had been meant to tarnish my reputation had, instead, turned my business into a local sensation. The controversy had sparked endless conversations, but more importantly, it had created awareness. My restaurant was no longer just another spot in town, it was the place people were talking about. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of it all. If I had simply treated Sarah's parents that night, if I had caved and paid for their meal, none of this would have happened. No viral post, no controversy, no influx of curious customers. I would have spent $100 on dinner and gone back to business as usual. Instead, I had stood my ground, and in doing so, I had gained something far more valuable than a single night's goodwill. My restaurant was thriving. My relationship with Sarah had survived. And in the end, Linda's attempt to damage my business had become the greatest advertising campaign I could have ever asked for.